Well, hello and welcome, and thank you all for returning from popcorn and scotcheroos for the government. I know, yeah, we're missing scotcheroos, Steve. Our government relations panel. We appreciate you hanging in here with us right as we head into the business meeting. So, as Kermit said, I am Jean Schafer, Senior Legislative Representative with the Basin GR team. I just want to introduce our panel. Today with me, I have Shawn Taylor, Executive Director with the Wyoming Rural Electric Association. To his right, I have Jenny Glumack, Director of Government Affairs with Minnesota Rural Electric Association. And I have Zac Smith, Communications and Government Relations Director with the North Dakota Association of Rural Electric Cooperatives. And I have Steve Barnett taking up the caboose, General Manager with the South Dakota Rural Electric Association. So if you'll notice, it was by design. I have two statewide managers and I have two statewide government relations directors, and that was by design. I wanted some balance on our panel today. So before we begin, I would like each of you to give a quick overview of your association makeup and then the makeup of your administrative legislative body in your state. Shawn, let's start with you.
Sure, thanks Jean, thanks for having me here today. Before I get to that, I need to give whoever's in the audience that drives a blue Tesla that's parked out in front with North Dakota plates that say coal-powered. I think that's genius. I took a picture of it and sent it to my kids. I love it. So at the Wyoming Rural Electric Association, we're made up of 11 distribution co-ops and 4 G&Ts, including Basin, Tri-State, Deseret, and Members First. We do have 3 associate members that are headquartered outside of Wyoming but serve a small population within our borders, and there's 3 of those that belong to the association as non-voting members. At the state legislature, we have 93 total members, 31 senators, and 62 House members. 86 of those total are Republicans, and we always joke that the 7 Democrats can caucus out in the phone booth out in the parking lot while the Republicans just beat each other up, and that's kind of what happens.
It sounds familiar a little bit in a few of the other states. Jenny, Minnesota.
Yes. Jenny Glumack, Director of Government Affairs for Minnesota. Thank you for having me. MREA is made up of 44 distribution co-ops and 6 G&Ts. We are a all-blue state. We serve 1.7 million member owners, and about 23% of the electricity in Minnesota is served by co-ops. We have a blue legislature, so Democrat Senate, Democrat House, and Democrat governor, maybe soon to be Vice President of the United States. So that's our makeup.
Great. And Zac?
Yeah, Zac Smith. I'm with the North Dakota Association of Rural Electric Cooperatives. NDREC is 17 distribution members and 5 generation transmission cooperatives. And our makeup for our legislature is pretty close to what Shawn said, really. It's a super majority. There's more infighting within the Republican Party than there is between the Democrats and the Republicans. We have less than a booth at a diner in the Senate for the Democrats. They can caucus in 1 booth, and then in the House it's a little more. We have a little more than 7 when you add the House in, but it's a super majority for the Republicans.
And Steve?
Yes, we've got a board of 30 members, 1 from Basin, 1 from East River out of Madison, and 1 from Rushmore. And we have 27 distribution cooperatives in South Dakota. Our legislature, like Zac said, we're strongly Republican. I want to say there's 8 Democrats in the House, and in the Senate side there's 4. And I was just talking to Senator Maher earlier. He said back in 2007 when he started, it was 15 Democrats in the Senate and 20 Republicans, so it's changed quite a bit. And in 2002, we actually had 3 Democrats at the federal level with Stephanie Herseth, Tim Johnson, and Tom Daschle. Now we have 3 Republicans, and John Thune, Mike Rounds, and Dusty Johnson, so it's changed quite a bit.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you for being part of this panel today. So we have a lot to cover, so let's dive in. So my first question for all of you is, when it comes to keeping the lights on for rural America, from the policy standpoint, what keeps you up at night? And I'm going to kick it right back down to Steve to start
I think for me, it's the amount of demand on the grid right now is really scary. From the data centers to the EVs that Shawn just mentioned, our schools, hospitals, law enforcement centers, we all require a lot of electricity. So do my kids, by the way. And I feel like the policies at the national level right now aren't jiving with the demand. So that's kind of sums it up for me. Is I think the supply, the policies are wanting to retire coal plants and whatnot, and I think that's going in the wrong direction. I think Jim Matheson with NRECA has done a good job articulating that message on the national level.
Zac.
So actually, last night, I found that I couldn't sleep, and I was just I thought Jenny might be bringing some legislators with her from Minnesota and bringing them over to North Dakota to pass some policy. No, I think it's similar to what, I wasn't meant for an applause break, but Tim Walz didn't get one, but, so for us, I think it's similar to what Steve's saying. I think when I close my eyes at night, I see a line graph that kind of makes an X, and the one that's going up is the demand for the projected demand for the future in load growth, and then the one that's going down, and it's not true for Basin Electric, but the one that's going down is what some of our friends over on the investor and utility side, it's what they're doing for baseload generation. So you kind of create an X where demand's going way up, but policy, investors, regulation are forcing the generation down, and you worry about where that goes, and at what point all these warnings about reliability when the chickens come home to roost, and ultimately the people who answer for that aren't our politicians usually, or anybody. It's the member services folks at your co-ops. So that's what keeps me up at night.
And Jenny, did you bring any legislators with you to terrorize
I did not.
Zac?
I'll remember to do that next time, Zac. So I'm going to dovetail off of what Steve and Zac said. I think, this meeting, the theme is reliability and affordability. And in Minnesota, we have passed a very ambitious, one of the most ambitious policies in the country, carbon-free by 2040. So what keeps me up at night is a segment of the population and of policymakers thinking that intermittent resources are going to be the answer. So, living in this unicorn, rainbow universe sort of keeps me up at night thinking about that, because we clearly need baseload energy, and communicating that to policymakers, as we're continually doing in Minnesota, is one of the most important things that we do in the state of Minnesota.
And Shawn.
I share the same thoughts, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, because obviously very concerned about the reliability and the supply and demand, but what's been keeping me up lately is wildfires. And what we need to do at the state levels all across the West and the national level. We're working in Wyoming. We're trying to get some liability relief legislation passed this coming session, and we're working with a lot of my counterparts, statewide managers across the West. We're all trying to do the same thing, to push a coordinated effort to DC and say, all right, we're taking care of what we can at the state level, but Wyoming's owned, the land is 50% managed by federal agencies, which I'll talk about that in a little bit too. But they need to do something on the federal side, and we're going to do what we can on the state side. We use the phrase, and I'm sure you've heard it. Jim Matheson, I think, uses it a lot, that we're all only one wildfire away from bankruptcy, and then who's going to provide the power to rural America or rural Wyoming? So that's what's been keeping me up.
Excellent. Well, you somewhat set up my next question. I wanted to roll into the federal realm and talk about some of the key agencies that each of you would work with, typically on your state issues, whether EPA, Forest Service, BLM, DOE, what have you. So since you set the stage for that, you are going to talk about that, why don't you lead us off on that, Shawn?
Sure. Well, the EPA is the easy target, but we don't, at the state level, we don't work with them. We leave that up to you guys at the G&T level and NRECA. Yeah, you're welcome. But in Wyoming, it's mainly Forest Service and BLM for one of the reasons that I just mentioned, wildfires, but also just rights of ways and management and veg management, which ties along with wildfires, but just accessing rights of ways, getting new rights of ways or renewing rights of ways. There's so much red tape and hoops that you have to jump through. We're actually starting next month. We're going to have a series of meetings with our BLM field offices, with the co-ops that they work with, and part of that is to try and just build relationships. We hear that from our BLM state office. Get to know your field ops people at the BLM offices, and we'll tell our folks to get to know the co-ops because they don't understand the differences between pipelines, for-profit utility power lines, not-for-profit co-op utility lines. They just don't draw a distinction in how we should and need to be treated a little differently because of the nature of our makeup and our load profiles. And so we're setting up a meeting to do kind of a co-op 101 with all these BLM field offices across the state, and then to also talk about and try and get on the same page as for permitting purposes. And just what do they need, what do the co-ops need to do in order to fill out the correct form. I mean, it sounds just, the minutia of it is just boring as hell, but we wanted to try and make sure everybody's on the same page. Forest Service, they're a little harder to work with than the BLM, but we have had meetings with the Forest Service folks, again, mainly to talk about vegetation management and why we can't cut this tree that we know if it blows over, it's outside of our right of way, it's gonna blow over and hit our line, why we can't just go cut it without. And they're doing some efforts on that at the federal level, but it moves slow.
Jenny.
Well, in addition to veg management and, of course, working with our G&Ts on the EPA rule, we are very involved in federal funding right now. So right now we're working with the DOE on our $309 million GRIP project. And it's, a consortium of 61 utilities around, and we expect to hear something about that in September. So that's sort of our main thing that we're working on right now. It's 1,600 work locations, and the project will impact 2.2 million folks in Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota, as you all know too.
Zach.
Yeah, I think as both Jenny and Shawn mentioned, I wouldn't say work with, maybe work against the EPA a little bit, and working with DOE as well on some of those opportunities. But I think for North Dakota, one of the unique things about the North Dakota statewide is a long time ago, our board had the foresight to add a rural development center to our statewide that works on really tough economic development issues like food supply chain issues, rural quality of life issues, things like that. And we have 4 colleagues at my office that work on those issues, and they work very closely with USDA rural development. So that's one of those, on the flip side of the coin, one of those government agencies that we work very closely with. We have a great state director. We've had a history of having great state directors here in North Dakota who are federal appointees, but our current one is Erin Oban, and she has a really great working relationship with us from her time in the state legislature. And we're really fortunate because they work on really hard issues for the betterment of North Dakota and all of North Dakota communities, whether they're served by co-ops or not. And that's one of those really, it's a success story, like I said, from the NDAREC board having the foresight to do that long ago, and now we have 4 colleagues working in our office working on that. So.
And Steve.
Yes, the state of South Dakota, we are working with the Department of Energy as well. We just recently applied for some federal dollars to help with some infrastructure improvements. Mr. Gukeisen with the state is taking the lead on that. We haven't heard any updates lately, but like Shawn too, our western co-ops on the western side of the state, Walker Witt is out there today. I know he works a lot with the BLM and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to kind of help with educating folks on vegetation management and that kind of thing. And we also work, one agency we all work with is RUS, the Rural Utilities Service, and we had a meeting with Senator Rounds last summer to kind of talk about some concerns, wanting them to operate more efficiently and effectively like a bank. Our managers are very cognizant of trying to get the lowest rate for our members. And They were supposed to kind of beef up their staff this summer to help with some of those, streamlining some of those processes. And Tom Jones, who lives in the northeast part of South Dakota, has been helpful with that. So,
Excellent. So let's roll into some state-specific issues, and I'll take turns putting each of you on the hot seat, so to speak. And I'm going to start with Zac. So here in North Dakota, it's almost become standard that a ballot measure surfaces on property tax relief, and here we are again in 2024, facing another ballot measure to repeal property tax. NDAREC, and I know you yourself specifically, have spent a lot of time on this issue and how it affects rural electric cooperatives, rural cities, and political subdivisions. So can you tell us how that work is going and some of the effects of that, what that measure could be?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gene. So if you guys want to take the next hour off, I can talk about this all day. And I think my board probably has heard it many times. But so first, what the measure does, it's a constitutional measure, which we've become pretty comfortable in North Dakota amending our constitution over the last few election cycles. So it's a constitutional measure, and what it says is that the political subdivision, which is your city council, your county commission, your school board, your park board, your rural ambulance, your rural fire, whatever it may be, cannot assess a property tax based on the assessed value of your property. So, sounds pretty good if you're a property owner, but then you get in the details and it gets a little bit scary as to how this is all gonna work. So, you can't assess a property tax, or you can't do a property tax on an assessed value. The state will have to take the 2024 level, what it's at right now, and the state will have to take that over and pay it to the locals. And after that, not really sure what happens. It'll have to be sorted out eventually, but there's really not a great plan at this point. So what would happen, essentially we're voting on this in November to put it in the Constitution that we can't do assessed value on a property tax, and then January, the legislature will come into session. They'll have 1.3 billion, roughly the number, hole in their general fund budget that they will have to fund for the locals. And then on top of that, the locals will have to probably lobby to figure out how they are going to deal with their local needs, because they may not have the funding authority in law now because it's been property taxes in the past. So our board has a concern with it. I think generally once people look at it, they have a concern with it because there's not really a good plan for how you're going to replace this revenue. I can tell you that one thing I failed to mention earlier on is that we have a legislature that meets every 2 years. So you have 80 days in the Constitution to get your work done for 2 years, and your budgeting for 2 years, which has proven to be a little more difficult than it used to be when we didn't have any money. It's proven to be a little more difficult to get all that done in 80 days now that we have, the Bakken has blown up, as I'm sure you're all aware, having listened to any of the panels earlier today. So you're going to go in January, say here's a $1.3 billion hole in the budget. The locals are going to say we need to have more authority to figure this out. I think the big concern on our end is if you're a city commissioner in Crosby, I think I know where there's one in the audience. I can't see him with these bright lights, but if you're a city commissioner in Crosby, you're kind of relying on a legislator from basically everywhere in the state but Crosby to know what your needs are in your community. And it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So our board decided to take a position on it. We've got a coalition called the Keep It Local Coalition. It's about 80 members strong and counting. We're raising money, but the real issue is education, because it sounds good. I don't like my property tax statement when I get it. I get why people are upset about their property taxes, but it's not, to just take a hatchet to it and say you can't do it anymore it's not a great way to do policy, and to do it by constitution, which is hard to change, is not great policy. And then I think at the end of the day, one of the biggest concerns I've heard from our membership is who's going to benefit the most. you're still going to pay locally, whether they decide you have a square footage tax on your property, or an acreage tax on your property, or increased sales tax, or a local income tax. If you live here, you're still going to pay. But the people who are going to benefit the most are the corporations and the landowners who don't live here. They're going to have a tax-sheltered asset that's going to accrue in value, and they don't have to pay anything to the state of North Dakota, and that just goes on forever. Maybe when they come in and buy some shotgun shells to hunt their land, maybe they'll add a little sales tax, but other than that, they're not contributing to their community. They're not paying for the road that goes up to their door. They're not paying for the snowplow operator that comes all the way out there. They're not paying for anything. So it's a big issue. Our board is concerned. We're helping lead the charge on this coalition. So.
Thank you. Next question is for you, Steve. South Dakota passed the Landowner Bill of Rights in your session this year, and it has not been met with broad enthusiasm. Indeed, those opposing have successfully gathered enough signatures for a ballot referendum to repeal it. Talk about a little bit how that process went, and then how your association is circumnavigating that process.
Sure. So it was known as Senate Bill 201 this past session, and like you said, it passed, was signed by the governor, and then there was enough signatures gathered now to put it on the November ballot. And it'll read on the November ballot as Referred Law 21, and a yes vote would enact it and be effective on July 1 of 2025, and a no vote would then it just goes away entirely. So that's where it's at right now, and we've got about 7 different ballot questions on the ballot this year. That's just one of them. So the people for it argued that it was, they wanted to keep setbacks, they wanted to take a little power from the townships or the county commissioner to the state, have the PUC do the citing, and some of them argued that some counties were unreasonably restrictive with their setbacks, maybe they're too far. And the people against it said, hey, we don't want to see power go from the local level to the state, you know. So that's kind of been the battle. You get Will Mortensen, Casey Crabtree, who kind of led that charge. I've talked to both of them. They say it's not like, you know, it's not a vote for or against the pipeline. Like these should help projects in the future, but the narrative right now is kind of if you're for 201, you're for the pipeline. If you're against it, then you know you're for the property rights owners. So that's kind of how it's getting construed right now. So, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of advertising on TV in the next several weeks.
Thank you, Steve. Shawn, you're up next. So, much like property tax relief in North Dakota, the idea of the generation tax to offset sales tax on electricity in Wyoming seems to surface again and again and again. The short answer to that is it's complicated, for sure. But can you give us some background on the issue and where the legislature is at regarding the feasibility study that they approved this session?
Sure, and I can give you 2 more words about the gen tax. It's dumb. I mean, the reasoning behind it is it's just kind of insane, but that's what we deal with. The Corporations Committee, which has jurisdiction over the co-ops and the utilities, they came up with this idea to impose a generation tax, and I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but in order to offset that tax, they would remove the sales tax on electricity for Wyoming citizens. And the point they're trying to get at is, in Wyoming, we generate and export, I want to say about 75 to 80% of the power generated in Wyoming. And so they want to tax everybody that we send that power to and not tax the Wyoming folks or give them a break on the sales tax. I don't even think it's constitutional. I'm kind of surprised it's made it this far without somebody saying that's unconstitutional, but I'm not an attorney, so I won't try and play one on stage. They did, so the committee said, let's move this forward, but then they pulled in other legislators from other committees for the interim, and they called it the Subcommittee on Generation Tax Study. And they put out an RFP to hire somebody to come in and do the legal work on it. Several of us, not just utilities, but folks from economic development and other stakeholders said, well, we also need to study what the economic impact would be to Wyoming citizens. And we've said if you can do this legally and it pencils out and you can prove to us with 100% certainty that our co-op members are not going to see well, they'll see a rise in their utility bill from the generation tax, but then it'll be offset by the sales tax. If you can prove to us 100% certainty that our folks will not be taxed or see an increase, then we don't have a problem with it. But they haven't been able to do that yet, and they've only just hired the person to do the RFP study on the legal side, and they have one more meeting before the end of the year, before we go into session next year, where they're supposed to get the report back and see what it says and then draft a bill. That's a long way of saying I think it's dead on arrival when we get to session. I think it's been a huge waste of time for a lot of people involved. And like you said, the generation tax crops up, every few years, but this has been probably the dumbest proposal I've seen.
Awesome. Thanks, Shawn. Jenny, Minnesota, land of unicorn and rainbows, their session pretty much devolved into a pretty chaotic mess at the end, and one of the victims in that was the tax appurtenances on co-op infrastructure. MREA has worked on this for years, so can you tell us more about this issue and how it got derailed by the chaos?
Yes, I'll try not to make everyone fall asleep with this issue. Attachments and appurtenances, say that 5 times fast. This is another property tax issue in Minnesota. So there's a 1939 statute in Minnesota where co-ops don't pay property tax on lights, meters, and load control receivers. Instead, they pay $10 per 100 members. Our Department of Revenue in Minnesota decided that they needed to clarify the language or reinterpret it, however you want to put it. We nicely clarify the language. So we have been trying to get that done for 4 years now. Some of our co-ops a few years ago started being assessed for these lights, meters, and load control receivers. And so we came up with some legislation with the Department of Revenue. And believe it or not, no opposition. It was in the governor's budget, it was in the Senate bill, it was in the House bill. Nobody testified against it, and it was in the tax conference committee report and still didn't go. This has now happened 3 years in a row. So if anybody on stage has any advice, I mean, you couldn't have better circumstances for something to pass, right? So anyway, it was a victim this session of, like Jean said, a very chaotic end. I know some of the Minnesota members saw how our session ended. It was essentially like a third world country with legislators screaming, and the Democrats essentially ran out of time. Republicans were filibustering, so they slammed through a 1,400-page bill at the end as they were running out of time. The tax bill fell apart in this process. There was a lot of screaming and disturbing behavior at the end of session, and so this fell to the wayside, so we will be back at it again.
That is not very unicorn and rainbow
No.
at all for a session. So this next question is for both Zac and Steve, as we sit here in the heart of North and South Dakota, parts of Iowa as well. In our industry, we must thread the needle very cautiously when it comes to our use of eminent domain, and as co-ops, we do everything in our power to not ever have to use that, and we're very, very cognizant and cautious of that. Yet it remains a very significant tool that we need in our toolkit in order for utilities to have projects and project viability. We've seen this surface. You've got it going on in South Dakota. We've dealt with it last session, Zac. In the state of North Dakota, going into a session in 2025, would like both of your thoughts on going forward, how do you think we want to roll with this issue?
Don't fight.
I get to go first. Great. No, I think some of the words you said in there, Jean, are kind of the best defense of eminent domain, and that's rarely use it, last resort. I think that's how we have approached it as cooperatives, and that's sort of the way to go about it to keep it intact. I think in North Dakota, there's a lawsuit going on that I'll spare all the details, but I'll tell you that one of the things that the landowners are arguing for is they don't like there's a different process potentially for going through and putting things underground and doing things like that, and they don't like that process, and the landowners are actually suing because they prefer eminent domain. So it's not that eminent domain is a dirty word. I think it comes down, it's not as much a policy issue as an operations issue. And in co-ops, you said it, it's a last resort. If we're operating in good faith with our members, then we don't have to use it necessarily unless we have to use it. So I think that's the way it's done in North Dakota, and that's the way we approach it. I think there have been other companies that have gotten a reputation of eminent domains, one of the first couple words out of their mouth, and then everybody's back is up. But in North Dakota, with our cooperatives, and that's not the way we operate. So it's not as much of a policy issue as an operational issue and a reputational issue of doing what's best for the membership, doing what's right by the landowner, and then going from there.
And Steve.
That's a good answer. I think it's intended as a last resort. I think in order to get people to come to the table, you kind of have to have it in your toolbox, as you indicated. Representative John Hanson, he's been involved in this, and he came up to me, it was at the Pizza Ranch during last session. He said, Steve, we don't have a problem with utilities using it as a last resort. We have a problem with private pipeline companies using it as a first resort. And I thought, that's fair. So I think, but there has to be, it needs to be for public use, for the greater good, as Zac indicated, a hospital, a road, providing electricity to our members. And there has to be just compensation, and that can be contentious. What would that property go for in the open market? And I think we've seen that in South Dakota, where if Jenny owns property in McPherson County and I own property in Brown County, I feel like my property maybe is worth more if it's on a busy intersection, that kind of thing. So, but yeah, it's definitely threading the needle, but I think it's something that, we have to have that ability in order to negotiate with people at the table.
Thank you, gentlemen. Shawn, this year the interim legislative committees have been addressing utility territory issues as well as that third-party generation issue, and they somewhat go hand in glove when you're working with them down there. How have you been addressing this in the interim here in Wyoming?
Yeah, it's been a crazy interim. It's usually not this busy, but kind of going back to what these folks said earlier about what keeps them up at night, for a number of reasons, and you see it nationally, but in Wyoming as well. Everybody would love to have a data center or an AI facility or crypto in their service territory or in their county or in their city, and so they're coming up with very interesting ways to try and do that. And they've been kind of nibbling around the edges of this for the past couple of years, even as far as going full deregulating the state of Wyoming. And short of that, they're legislatively, they did talk about third-party generation, behind-the-meter generation. That's since been kicked over to the Public Service Commission, but what that would essentially allow under the current rule as we know it is, and I'm going to use industry that some folks might not be familiar with, but it's happening in Wyoming, and that's the trona industry, soda ash. We have these huge mines in southwest Wyoming, and they're starting to expand, and they require huge loads. That's something that we can wrap our heads around, but when you start talking about AI and data centers and the massive amounts of power they're going to use, they're looking at this third-party generation rule to allow somebody, an entity, and we'll use the trona industry, to pay somebody to come in, build generation, whatever that might look like, generate electricity, sell it to this company, which that's called self-generation, which is allowed right now. But then it goes further, and they could sell to the next company down the road, the next company down the road, and just start cherry-picking these large loads, which eventually you get to deregulation. And not only would they be able to do that, but they wouldn't be regulated as a public utility, even though they're building, generating, and selling electricity. They wouldn't have to adhere to all the same regulations that the traditional utilities have to adhere to under the Public Service Commission, and assuming industrial siding and all other, if they're not considered a utility, then they're exempt from a lot of these. So we've been pushing back on that. In fact, we had on Monday this week, we had 15 co-op representatives, we had G&Ts there, we had distribution folks to meet with the governor, because the rule right now from the Public Service Commission, it's already passed the Attorney General's, purview or whatever, legality review, and now it's sitting in the governor's office. And it was a great meeting, and I've been hoping to get an email today saying, because we asked them to just push pause on this rule, because we can work with you, we can work with these entities, but you just can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, to hopefully land some shiny new AI facility in our outside of Cheyenne, Wyoming. We have Microsoft and Meta or Facebook building data centers like crazy down in Cheyenne, but the utility down there has an interesting tariff that allows them to attract these customers. And but the legislator out in rural Wyoming would really love to land one of those data centers out there, but third party and dereg, and those aren't the way to do it. So we've been pushing back pretty hard.
Thank you. Jenny, the Minnesota Energy Committee's made permitting reform a priority this year. That actually did pass. So can you tell us why that was such a high priority and how it got passed?
Yeah, so going back to the 2040 carbon-free bill, there's clearly a lot of things that are going to happen for that policy to work in Minnesota, and one of those things is permitting reform. So there was a group of about 30 stakeholders. It was a bipartisan effort to get more transmission, more solar, and more wind generation passed quickly to reach that 2040 goal. So it was a top priority for both the Senate and the House Energy Committees. We were a part of achieving the passage of that policy, and it's just one of the things that Minnesota is going to need for that policy to succeed.
Great. All right, so final question for everybody. All of our member states are in session on the odd years, and we're heading into one of those. So my last question to wrap up is, what message can our members help to reiterate to policymakers on behalf of our co-ops, and how can they best do that? And I'm going to start with you, Steve.
Well, I think the biggest thing is we want to get the message out. We want to provide safe, reliable, affordable power to our members. And to kind of communicate that to the policymakers, I think emails, trying to have a cup of coffee with them. I call it the off season, when session isn't going on, because our sessions are short. They're like 38 days. Get to know them. Send them a letter, send them some information, stuff that they can understand. And I think the policymakers need to listen to all the stakeholders involved. I think it's key for the lawmakers to get a better understanding of our industry and do good research and that kind of thing. But I think just South Dakota, North Dakota, we're small states, under 1 million people. I think just reaching out to your lawmakers, and a lot of them don't live too far away from you, just trying to have a conversation with them and educate them on issues, that goes a long ways.
Zach?
Yeah, I think if there's a message, I think if I were a little more put together, like our friend Bobby Hamill, I'd probably have a shovel up here and say, put down the shovel, right? But I think for North Dakota, I think we're very proud of the energy we generate here in terms of all the energy that we produce here in North Dakota. We're proud of, whether it's coal, natural gas, renewable, hydro. We're proud of all of it. So when the legislators get there and they hear about reliability, and legislators want to legislate, there's a tendency to think we can legislate our way through reliability, and it's not always the best path, and it's also not always the state's purview when you have the RTOs and NERC and FERC and all these things that when I start talking about, their eyes glaze over, but it's an educational piece, which to Steve's point, I think that what everybody can do in this room is host their legislators. We now, like South Dakota, are dealing with term limits in North Dakota, and we're going to start seeing a huge turnover in the next 2 years. So the people who know about us filling the buses, about a Territorial Integrity Act, they're not going to be there anymore. So when they get there, there's no, when I walk in and I testify on a bill, there might be a joke from the folks who've been there for 20, 30 years who say, you're not going to fill the buses on this one, are you? They're not going to know what buses I'm even talking about at this point, because they will just have gotten there. They have 80 days to figure out a budget and whatever laws and whatever cultural issues or social issues they want to deal with, they got to get it all done for the next 2 years. So our members, and we're helping them through this process, are going to have to meet with folks, get them up, talk about your co-op, how it's different from the co-op next to you, how your load profile is unique. Put them up in a bucket truck, show them your system, get them through your co-op, and just teach them about who you are, so that when I'm at the Capitol at the podium, they realize that there's somebody back home that I'm representing, because that's more important than just Zac Smith, the lobbyist, or Gene Schafer, the lobbyist. We have great relationships, but we can't be best friends with everybody. They got to know that there's somebody back home that we're representing.
Jenny.
Yes, I would agree with what Steve and Zach said. I'll also add that I think our Minnesota members do a phenomenal job of reaching out to their legislators, and the proof of that is, we're in a 3 blue scenario for the last 2 years. Things could have, gone through, a bunch more mandates, all of that, and it's because of your relationships with your local legislators that we've been successful in stopping and passing stuff at the Minnesota legislature. But I think the ongoing message for Minnesota is, again, with the 2040 carbon-free bill, is we need to really scrutinize, say that 5 times fast, any policy that is going through, the legislature or on the regulatory realm. Is the policy going to help utilities get to 2040 carbon-free, or is it going to impede the process? And those are the things that we really need to look at through the lens of reliability and affordability and versatility. So I think that's the message that we need to convey as we move forward into the 2025 session. And there'll be, things that we're going to look at within that reliability and affordability lens that we're going to need to take on, whether it's, getting rid of the nuclear moratorium, net metering reform, and those sorts of things.
Great. And final thoughts, Shawn?
Sure, I would agree with what everybody said. My message would be get out there and tell legislators, elected officials, who we are, what we do, and why we do it. And that encompasses a lot, but it really drives the message home. Who we are, we're rural Wyoming. We're your constituents. We're trying to provide reliable, affordable electricity to your constituents, right? This is a nonprofit. Explain that to them, because it takes a little while for the light to come on, but I think we've done a really good job of this in Wyoming, just recently, really. And there was a gal on the reliability panel had that train wreck slide, the EPA train wreck slide, which is really busy, but tells a really good story. We kind of managed that or changed that up a little bit to allow going back to the federal agencies. Let's put on there what BLM is proposing, what DOE is proposing, what Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, and all these other ones. And the point being, when I go to testify and I show them that slide, my point is, whatever you're trying to do to help us, just look at what we're already dealing with, and that's G&T level on down to the distribution level. And what I say, we are doing a pretty good job of this in Wyoming. One thing that I forgot to mention that the Corporations Committee did just at the end of July, they threw a new agenda topic on their agenda that said reform of the utility industry, and that got my attention, and then I got everybody else's attention, because that's a pretty big deal with what I just talked about earlier, third party, dereg. What do you mean reforming the industry? And I got folks from Basin, from Tri-State, from Deseret, and Members First, as well as some managers from my distribution co-ops, and we showed up with about 17 or 18 of us. We didn't all speak, but it was just a massive good showing when we just walked in there, and You know, one of the chairmen was like, oh, there's the co-ops. I'm like, that's right, you got our attention, so you're gonna sit there and listen to us. And the G&Ts, they don't get talked about much in the legislature, but they did a really good job of explaining the relationship between, you know, this big utility in Bismarck or in Denver or Salt Lake and what they provide to their constituents, our members. So just getting that message apart. Jean came down to Riverton one time when they asked her to talk about markets, and she did a great job of explaining markets that I could even understand it, much less the legislature. But you know, I've relied on these folks, the whole co-op family in Wyoming, to help carry that message, who we are, what we do, and why we do it. And it's starting to resonate.
Excellent. Thank you all for being here today. This concludes our government relations panel. Please help me in thanking my panelists, Shawn, Jenny, Zac, and Steve.